Beautiful people, hello and welcome to the narrated PowerPoint for Chapter 9, Managing Groups and Teams. First major topic, group dynamics. Basically, what's happening within the group? How is the group working? How are people getting along with each other? That's what we're talking about when we say group dynamics. Start with the basics. What is a group? I don't think there's anything terribly surprising on this slide. A group is a collection of individuals who interact with each other to achieve common goals. As it says here, groups and teams are an essential component of an organization's success. This is how work gets done in organizations. And quite frankly, being able to work in a group is a key skill for every single person, something each one of you needs to continually hone to get better and better at. Now, one thing I want to be clear about while we're still on this slide talking about what is a group. While the text does take some time to talk about the difference between a group and a team, frankly, that's of little interest to me. You won't be asked any exam questions where you're prompted to somehow differentiate between a group and a team, and I'm going to use those terms interchangeably. So hopefully that's not confusing in any way. A couple of different kinds of groups or types of groups, at least very broadly. There are informal groups. So again, we're talking about within the organization. That's where I want you to focus. So imagine within a workplace, informal groups that are made up of two or more individuals who are associated with one another in ways that are not prescribed by the formal organization. So the formal organization has nothing to do with how or why this particular kind of group of people comes together. This could be the folks who routinely have lunch together on Wednesdays. This could be folks who've decided to be part of a bowling team outside of work, people who have something in common. It has nothing to do with what the organization has tried to structure. On the other hand, a formal work group is made up of managers, employees, or both with close associations that influence the behavior of individuals in the group. So people in a department would be considered a formal work group. More broadly, people in a division might be considered a formal work group. People who've been assigned to a project together would be considered a formal work group, and so on. So let's talk about the stages of group development. There are two different models that I'm going to talk about. This very first one was first described by a researcher by the last name of Tuckman. He published this in 1965. He was a sociologist, and he said that groups, most especially temporary groups, go through a model of behaviors similar to what you're seeing here. So forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning when it's all done. Sadly, that last one does not rhyme with the others, but no worries. Let's dive into the particulars. Forming. This is when the group first comes together. People are typically pretty excited, optimistic about what they're going to be doing. The goals, okay, let's try to get to know each other. Okay, let's talk about how we're going to work, what we're going to do, who's going to do what. Think about, for example, your small group or team coming together to work on the assignment you were given with the last chapter. So, forming, just getting started. Second stage, storming. So now the group has had a chance to start working together. People stop trying to impress one another. They shed or lose their social facades, that face, that mask they might wear when they're trying to impress or be nice to other people. People start to become more authentic and maybe even a bit more argumentative. Individuals start to explore their power, their influence. You're starting to get a sense of whether what they say is listened to by others, for example. Discussions can become heated as the group tries to figure out what it's going to do and who's going to do what. And sometimes members can become defensive or competitive or even jealous of one another. Some people in this stage will actively avoid any kind of conflict. So they'll just be silent because they don't want anything to do with any sort of arguments. When people say things that they don't agree with, they're not going to say anything. Or if they do, they're going to be more passive aggressive, maybe snotty in their tone, for example. Here's my experience. This is the phase that most student project groups never actually get out of. And the reason they don't is they don't decide to manage the conflict. In order to move on to the next stage, the group has to become adept at raising conflict and managing that conflict. And for a variety of reasons, many students, they just don't want to deal with anything remotely resembling conflict. So they'll just go along, they'll just concede, they'll maybe decide to not put in all their effort, but they'll just kind of keep going along because, you know, we just want to get this project done. And as a result, because they don't move on, because they don't manage this stage well and move on, what they produce is not as good as what they could have produced if, in fact, they had confronted, dealt with, managed the conflict that goes with this stage. Stage is norming, and again, remember what I said, a lot of student project groups never get to this stage. When groups do get to it, people are more committed to each other and the group's goal. They find it easy to establish the ground rules, figure out, okay, how are we going to get things done? What will be our standard operating procedures and our goals? The overall group will tend to make the big decisions, and either individuals or subgroups will be allowed or delegated those smaller decisions. And the leader in a group that's at this stage needs to be more of a facilitator, sort of step back, let the group take on more responsibility, essentially where, as we learned in the leadership chapter, that person needs to delegate, facilitate, but really let the group decide rather than simply the leader making decisions for the group. The fourth stage is performing. Man, this is when we are the winning championship team. Participants, people in the group are getting the work done. They're paying a lot of attention to how well they're doing. The group is matured. People are more competent. They're more autonomous, meaning they're happier working alone, and they're good at it, and they're still sharing information back and forth. And the group is becoming more reflective and insightful about itself. The final phase is adjourning. When we're talking about groups that are project-based, temporary, much like the team or group that you had for your assignment for the last chapter, these are short-term. And so what we need to do is find a way to close the group, to maybe do a bit of an after-action review to debrief, okay, what worked, what didn't work, what would we do differently, to acknowledge each other's efforts, and then celebrate, hey, we did a great job. So what can groups do to avoid getting stuck in that storming phase? As I said, a lot of student groups never get out of that phase. What can they do? Well, they can, first of all, normalize conflict. Make it clear that it's really okay to disagree with one another. That's normal. It's part of the process. It's the only way that we get to the best ideas, etc. We can be inclusive and make sure everyone is heard. So let's invite different opinions. Let's be sure to ask, is there something that we're missing? Is there a different way to think about this? Does anybody have any other ideas? Has everyone had a chance to chime in? We need to support everyone. Sometimes people will need a bit more help with their specific tasks. Other members need to step up and make that happen. People also have to get good at asking for that help. People need to stay positive. It is absolutely possible to get through the storming phase and end up on the other side in good shape. In fact, again, as groups do their best work in terms of managing this conflict, the outcome will be positive. And finally, don't rush the group's development. Recognize that just trying to hurry up and get stuff done is not the right approach. You'll get something done, but it won't be anywhere near what you could have done if, in fact, you had worked through everyone's opinions and all of the potential conflict and come to a consensus view on what should we be thinking and doing. A second model of group development is the punctuated equilibrium model. The person responsible for this, her last name is Gerzik. She published this initially in 1983. And this says that, you know, those temporary groups that we're talking about, again, think of, as an example, a project group that you've been on as a student. This model suggests that groups tend to remain fairly static, maintaining a certain equilibrium for long periods of time. Now, when we say this, we're talking about the amount of effort, what's actually happening within the group, okay? So as you imagine over the course of a semester, if you had a full semester for a student group project, for most of that semester, the amount of collective effort that will be exerted will be about the same. And then things might change. So you'll see any change during these periods tends to be incremental. Why is it only incremental? Because people will resist making change. And then what you'll see are revolutionary changes. These occur in brief, punctuated bursts. They're generally catalyzed by a crisis or a problem. But here's what happens in student project groups that have a semester, for example. And the key crisis is a deadline. It's time. So the group starts out at the beginning of the semester. They've got a big project they need to do over the course of the semester, perhaps something where they'll have to write a report and give a presentation. The effort level starts out really high. People are excited, maybe even some folks talking about, you know, we could probably finish this early. Awesome. And then a few weeks into the semester, the level of effort sort of dwindles and it stays pretty consistently low until we get to about the halfway point in the semester. In the spring, that would be spring break. Suddenly, people realize, holy moly, we've only got half a semester left. And you'll see, again, a burst of energy and effort. And lots of talk about, oh my, okay, this is what we're going to need to do in order to get this done. Great. So what has catalyzed that burst of energy or enabled that burst of energy is the realization that, holy mackerel, we're halfway through. Then what happens after that burst? More sort of incremental change, more equilibrium. The effort level is higher than it was in the first half of the semester, but still not as high as it could be. Until we get to almost the end of the semester, maybe a couple weeks before the end. And all of a sudden, once again, people realize, holy, that deadline is right around the corner. We'd best get our act together. This is the final 2 minutes. This is the last gasp. And all of a sudden, you're going to see a ton of effort being exerted. This is very normal. The catalyst is the deadline. Time passage and deadlines are key to getting people to exert effort. What's a major takeaway when you look at this model? That if you want people to work at a higher level, you've got to have interim deadlines. So you can't just have one deadline that's, 14 weeks away or a year away. That's too long. People can't organize their effort around a deadline that's so far away in their minds. Instead, you need to have interim deadlines. And what those will do is they will catalyze or facilitate extra effort so that the group can, in fact, do its best work. Another major topic associated with group dynamics is cohesion. Think of the word cohere, which means to stick. So cohesion is stickiness. When we talk about it within groups, we're talking about the degree of camaraderie. How closely do people stick together? The text makes a statement that the more cohesive a group is, the more productive it will be and the more rewarding the experience. And I'm here to tell you, this is not always true. And I'll explain why a few slides from now. But trust me, it is not always true. Some of the factors that will affect group cohesion include similarity. So the more similar people are to one another, the greater the group cohesion, and the more they're likely to stick together. The stability is another one. The more stable the group is, the greater the likelihood that they'll be cohesive. Size matters. Generally speaking, the smaller the size, the greater the likelihood that the group will be cohesive. Support matters. The more support that people offer each other and that is offered from elsewhere, the greater the likelihood that the group will be cohesive. And then finally, satisfaction. The more satisfied people are within that group, the greater the likelihood that the group will be cohesive, that people will want to stick together. So what do we need to do? You're a leader, you want to maintain a cohesive team, people who are willing to stick together. Well, align that group with the greater organization and its goals. Let members have choices in setting their own goals, their team's goals. Define really clear roles for people so that everyone knows exactly what they're doing and they know how what they do contributes to the whole and how they interact with everybody else. So they know how important not only they are, but how important everybody else is. Physically situate people in close proximity to each other. When people are working closer to one another, they are more likely to communicate more frequently. That's going to facilitate that cohesiveness. Praise the group frequently. Treat everyone with dignity and respect. These are pretty basic ideas, right? Celebrate those differences. We're glad to have them. They help us to do better work overall. And then really importantly, establish common rituals. Things that the team, the group does routinely that enables them to see themselves as part of an in-group. Is it possible for a group to have too much cohesion? Yeah, actually it is. Internal pressure to conform can cause members to avoid conflict with one another, and we know that's not a good thing. People have to manage conflict. They can't just run away from it. That same pressure to conform can cause people to focus more on trying to please each other rather than trying to do their best work. And people might, in fact, censor themselves to maintain the party line. They might not share their ideas. They might not share their different perspectives. They might not point out their disagreements because they basically just want to get along. This leads to this phenomenon called groupthink, which we'll talk more about in our final chapter. But basically, it increases the risk of the group making really bad decisions as it allows for reductions in mental efficiency, reality testing, moral judgment. People just make assumptions that, hey, you know what, we can't disagree, we got to go along. What other people are saying must be true, it must be okay, it must be ethical. And basically, we stop people from sharing their best ideas. That's not a good thing. So cohesion can be bad. Cohesion, when it's bad, can lead to poor performance. So let's look at this 2 by 2. On the x-axis, we're looking at task commitment. So how committed are people to the goals of the team? And on the y-axis, we're looking at cohesion, so group cohesion. When there's low group cohesion, so people don't really stick together, and people aren't very committed to the goal, you would expect pretty low performance. No surprise there, right? When you see low group cohesion, so people don't really stick together, but individuals are really committed to what is supposed to be happening, or at least most people are pretty committed to what's happening, you're going to see a range of performance depending on lots of other factors, including people's ability. With high group cohesion, so again, these are folks who are really sticking together. They have each other's backs. Look what's going on in that lower left quadrant. When the individuals are not committed to the goal, but everybody in the group is highly committed to each other, guess what? We're going to have not just low performance, but the lowest performance. These people will work to not perform at a high level. They will persuade each other to keep their level of performance, productivity, as low as possible. In the lower right quadrant, what you see when you have a highly cohesive group and everyone is committed to the task, this is the sweet spot. This is ideal. This is where you see the highest level of group performance. So what's the takeaway? You want to help people commit to the goal, and you want to help that group be cohesive. When you do that, those two things together, you're likely to see the highest levels of group performance. Another element, group dynamics that we hear about, you've seen it, social loafing. Another word for this, slacking off. This is when people put in less effort because they're in a group, and basically they know that somebody else will pick up the slack. And maybe it's a function of the simple fact that there isn't enough work for everyone in the group to do, at which point it's a very rational decision to slack off. As the size of the group grows, the effect of social loafing becomes larger. Basically, there isn't enough for people to do, and it's easier to hide, quite frankly. Think about the biggest classes you've ever taken. In those classes, it's relatively easy, generally speaking, holding everything else constant, to not participate. But when the class is smaller, now it's obvious that, you sharing your opinion is important and valuable, and you can't just hide. How do we prevent social loafing? Very carefully choose the number of individuals you need to actually get the task done. No more, no less. Clearly define each member's tasks in front of everybody else. Make it clear what everybody is supposed to be doing. That way, people know, again, how they're supposed to be interacting with each other. Design and then communicate to everyone a system for evaluating each person's individual contribution. Super important. I'll come back to that later. Do everything you can to build a cohesive group. Do your best to basically do the thing that will prove motivating. Give people a good job. Assign tasks that are highly engaging and inherently rewarding, so people want to do them. They're interesting. They don't want to slack off. And then ultimately, make sure that everyone feels they're needed. Don't let anybody walk away at any point thinking, well, you know what, if I don't show up, if I don't do my part, it doesn't really matter. No. Make sure that everyone knows every single thing they do matters. Another important topic, the topic of collective efficacy. Earlier in the term, we talked about self-efficacy, which is basically an individual's task-specific self-confidence. Now we're talking about collective efficacy. And this talks about the group's perception of how well it thinks it can perform. Think about a winning sports team, all right? And when one is a member of a winning sports team, we feel like, man, we can do anything. We can take on anybody any day. Think about tournament. Any day could be our day. What affects collective efficacy? Watching the other people in the group, people within the group verbally persuading each other, and then, of course, how we feel. Do we feel like we're part of a winning team? And when people feel like that, man, the impact on performance is extraordinary. Even if the group's ability is not as high as, let's say, another group's ability, the group with the higher collective efficacy can still outperform the group with a higher level of raw ability. This explains why, when we're into March Madness, while we'll see some underdog teams that will take out the teams that we're expected to win. Why? It's not so much that they have greater ability, but they're coming in more psyched, thinking we can do this, we've got what it takes, working together we can do some amazing things, and sure enough, they will perform at a higher level. Well, let's talk now about team design characteristics. So we spent a lot of time talking about group dynamics. Now we're going to shift gears and talk about team design characteristics. Different kinds of tasks that teams might undertake. And again, I'm saying team here. We could be talking group. Same difference. Production tasks, so we're actually making something. Idea generation tasks, we're trying to come up with something creative, ideas essentially, not so much that we're actually in the job of producing. For example, if I had asked you all to come up with an idea for a video but hadn't actually asked you to produce the video, it would have been an idea generation task. And what you needed to do was both idea generation and production. And then finally, problem-solving tasks are those where we come up with plans for actions and then we make decisions. Teams have different levels of task interdependence. That's defined here as the degree to which team members are dependent on one another to get information, support, or materials from other members. So 4 different kinds of interdependence. The first is pooled interdependence. Basically here, team members can go off, work independently, and then later on combine their efforts to create the team's output. So imagine a paper in which there are 5 sections. You've got 5 team members. Each team member is an expert on the topic associated with their section. They go write their section, and then at the end of it all, somebody just pulls all those sections together. That's a great example of pooled interdependence. Yeah, they depend on each other, but for the most part, they're working independently. Sequential interdependence is when one person's output becomes another person's input. So here, think about, for example, an assembly line where I do some work on something and then I pass it along to you. My output is your input, and you're going to do something with that, and then you're going to pass that on to another person. Okay, so it isn't just pooling all of our efforts, like we saw with pooled interdependence, but I'm literally going to take what the person before me had finished, and I'm going to add to that. Not just another section that doesn't touch on that first section, but I'm going to maybe make changes to that first section, and then I'm going to add, and then I'm going to pass it on to the next person who will maybe make changes to the first and second sections and then add on more. Reciprocal interdependence happens when everyone's working together basically at the same time. So they're all working on all sections of that paper all together, essentially writing it all at the same time. So there's lots of back and forth, there's lots of dialogue. So the outcome comes together collectively. And finally, outcome interdependence exists when the rewards that any one individual receives depend on how well other people have done. Okay? So if you want to think about this in terms of a sports analogy, for example, how well a basketball player, their shooting and their likelihood of getting a basket, it's really going to depend on the rest of the team and how the ball moves down the court and whether an assist is made at the right time, etc. That would be a great example where outcome interdependence would be pretty high. Teams have roles. So groups have roles. All of these roles, everything that you're seeing on this slide, and this is again in the text also, all of these roles need to get played. But that doesn't mean that we need to have 10 people. Individuals can play multiple roles, right? So one person could have 3 roles or 4 roles. But all the roles have to be played. There are task roles. So contractor, creator, contributor, completer, critic. There are social roles. Those are the ones in yellow, calibrator, communicator, cooperator. And then boundary spanning roles. These are the ones in orange. So take some time to look at these. Take some time to understand what's going on with each of these. Types of teams. You're going to run into all different kinds when you're working in organizations. You might be on a temporary team that could be called a task force or a working group. You could be on a product development team. This could be a temporary thing, or it could be ongoing, where your team or group is charged with developing one or perhaps a series of products. You might be part of a cross-functional team where people with different functional expertise are brought together to work perhaps on projects or products. So by cross-functional, we're saying marketing, IT, manufacturing, accounting, HR. So the team has people with expertise in all of those different functional areas. A virtual team, that happens when people aren't in the same physical place. So for example, you might find yourself part of a global virtual team where the other members of the team are located in other facilities. The top management team, these are the people who are part of what we call the C-suite. These are appointed by the CEO, and they typically reflect the skills and areas that the CEO thinks matter most for the company. Typically finance, manufacturing, talent management, IT, etc. When we talk about leadership and autonomy, sort of traditional teams have a manager, someone who's appointed to be the leader. So the manager serves as the team leader, and that person assigns work to other members. Managers may have the power to hire and fire team members. They may or may not, depending on the organization's policies and procedures. Self-managed teams, on the other hand, don't have a manager, one person, who is responsible for leading the team. Instead, the teams manage themselves. They don't have necessarily a supervisor who is assigning work to each member. Instead, the team members will select their own leader. They may even take turns as the leader. They share responsibility for whatever it is they're doing. And they have the authority to go ahead and get done what they're doing if they've been empowered. That word tells us that they have authority. In other words, they don't need to get anybody else's permission to do what they need to do. All right, a final major topic area. So we talked about group dynamics, we talked about team characteristics, and now we're going to sort of pull this stuff together and talk about, okay, let's say you wanted to be in charge of an effective team. What would you need to be thinking about as you designed that team? Well, you need to think about team composition. There are, in fact, 3 major areas. Team composition is the first of those 3 major areas. So you need to give careful thought to how big do you want the team to be, and what kind of diversity do you want represented within your team. The right composition, the appropriate composition, depends on what you're trying to do. What exactly are you trying to do? That's what helps you decide what kind of team. Think about it this way. This makes total sense when you use a sports analogy, right? We know that football teams need to be a certain size, basketball teams need to be a different size, baseball teams still a different size, and so on. And the kinds of diversity that you want on those different teams will be a function, again, of what they're doing. Well, it's the same in the work setting. What we're doing is going to drive, or should drive, just how big the team is and what kind of diversity. So who's going to be best for the team? Well, we want to make sure that everybody's qualified. This means that we need to know people's KSAs, knowledge, skills, abilities. What do they know? What are they good at doing, right? Also, what kind of personality traits do we need? So for example, I'm helping people put together some teams for a major effort on campus. And what I'm asking people to think about in terms of choosing team members or group members is, well, we want some people who know a lot about St. Norbert College, who maybe have been here a long time. And we want other people who are newer, who may see things a bit differently than people who've been here for a long time. In terms of personality, we want people who like to be efficient. We want people who are highly reliable or conscientious. We want people who represent diverse aspects of the college. So we want faculty, staff, and students. We want people from the different divisions or majors, the different departments represented, because we need all those different perspectives to help us do the overall project that I'm responsible for leading. As we talk to people, we need to make sure they know what they're going to be asked to do and what the expectations will be. For example, how often will they meet? What will their workload be? The last bullet here, we need to think about diversity in terms of people's personalities, their gender, age, education, their functional area. So do they have a stronger background in marketing or IT, talent management, et cetera? And then, of course, their experience. And notice what I had said. We don't always just want people who have a lot of experience. We also will want people who have less experience, because they will see things differently than those folks who have a lot of experience. So really, how large should the team be? It says, the text says between 2 and 20 members. When you get past 20, you typically have less cooperation. It's tougher to coordinate. Just think about scheduling, how hard that is. Even with 5 people, scheduling a meeting, a get-together, can be very difficult. It's also really difficult to interact with one another once you get to a very large team. People tend to break off into subgroups instead of working with the whole. On the other hand, with fewer people, it may be easier for folks to work through any differences and to come to an agreement on a common plan of action. Ultimately, though, what matters the most in terms of deciding how big should the team be is the goals that the team has to accomplish. You want to make sure you have just the right number of people to do what needs to be done, not one more, not one less. So team size, as it says, should be matched to the goals of the team. That is what matters most. Continuing with team composition, so we talked about diversity, we talked about size. We need to talk about abilities, so we need to have technical skills, we need problem solving and decision making skills, and interpersonal skills. Within the team, we need all of these skills. People who know the particulars of how to do the job, people who are great at solving problems and making decisions, people who are really good at getting along with each other, who are good at helping other people manage conflict. We also need to think about personality. We want people who are open to ideas. We want people who are conscientious, people who are reliable, who will get the job done. Extroversion, introversion, basically we need both. We want people who will get the party started. Those are the extroverts. They will be the ones who toss out initial ideas typically, but we also need introverts who will be reflective. We need folks to be generally agreeable, and we also need a bit of neuroticism, not too much, just enough so there's a desire to get the job done and get it done well. Obviously, one bad apple can spoil the barrel. Basically, what that means is having somebody who's very difficult to work with, they can make it so that nobody wants to be part of that team. You all know what that's like. Also, member flexibility. This needs to be valued, okay? So we want people who can be flexible with respect to their tasks and roles, and we need to provide cross-training so that people are, in fact, able to be flexible. We talked a little bit about roles previously. All of them, as I mentioned before, need to be filled. So people are often going to play multiple roles. 3 that I want to call out in particular. We need the coordinator. This is our person who gets all that scheduling done. Make sure that we're meeting as often as we need to and as frequently as we need to and when we need to meet to, et cetera, and for as long as we need to. Someone who pulls everything together. We've got to have people playing the creator role. These are the folks initiating those creative ideas. And we've got to have folks who are communicators, people who know how to advocate or champion an idea after they're initiated, people who will help persuade other people that the ideas are in fact really good ones. Okay, so that was all team composition. Lots of things listed under team composition that need to be thought about. Second major category of the 3. So we had team composition. Now the context in which the team or the group is operating. First, team's got to have the resources it needs. They've got to have information. They've got to have equipment. They've got to have staffing. So this is support stuff. They've got to have encouragement from the rest of the organization and whatever administrative assistance is needed to help with logistics, scheduling meetings, finding rooms, getting that equipment, et cetera, et cetera. There also needs to be a climate of trust. People need to believe in each other's competence and character. They need to believe that people have integrity, that when people say they will do something by a certain date to a certain level, people will in fact follow through. That climate of trust is absolutely essential. And then reward systems. If we want the team to work well together, we have to make sure that, number one, individuals are rewarded for their individual efforts. So we've got to be able to identify the contributions of each individual. And we also need to have team-focused rewards so that it becomes clear to the individuals that they must work together in order to achieve those team rewards. So both individual and team-focused. The final major category, team process. So we talked about team composition. We talked about team context, and now we've got process. Process is the how do we get stuff done. First and foremost, we need to have common purpose. What overall are we trying to accomplish? What is our overall vision? This is what's going to give us direction. This is what's going to provide momentum. This is what's going to help people be committed. People have to be excited about that common purpose. You know, we're going to be doing X, and once we've done that, it's going to be amazing. Second, SMART goals. Specific, measurable, aligned/aggressive, realistic, and time-bound. These goals will facilitate communication with the group. People will know what needs to get done exactly, why, what that goal will help to accomplish overall, and then the timing. When we set SMART goals, we can hold other people accountable. In other words, we can say, hey, you know what? We need this by Tuesday. That's what we agreed to. What's happening? What progress are you making? Are you, in fact, going to get this thing done by Tuesday that you said you would get done? If not, what help do you need? What other resources do you need in order to get the goal accomplished? Team efficacy or group efficacy or collective efficacy. As I mentioned before, this is collective self-confidence. And the reality is that success breeds success. As we have success within our team, within our group, we will believe more and more and more that we can accomplish anything. We can do anything. Fourth is something that's interesting, the idea of productive conflict. So there are different kinds of conflict. Some are great, they're important, they're essential, and some not so much. The really good stuff is what we call cognitive or task conflict. This is where we have disagreements around what we're doing or how we're doing it. And when we have these disagreements and we resolve those disagreements, when we manage those conflicts, we ultimately end up with better process, which ultimately leads to better outcomes. So we want those disagreements. We want people to point out, you know, I just don't think this is going to work the way we've been talking about it so far. What if we tried this instead? Okay, so productive conflict, it's not just raising problems, it's also bringing solutions or proposing ideas that might help to resolve whatever the conflict might be. This is in contrast to the kind of conflict that's not good, the stuff that virtually everybody likes to avoid, what's known as affective or relationship conflict. This is the personal stuff. This is, I don't like the way you look kind of stuff. This is, I think the way that you conduct yourself is not ideal kind of conflict. Well, that's the kind of stuff that really individuals operating within a team or a group, they really don't have any business talking about that stuff. They need to just not worry about that kind of conflict. Instead, stay focused on the good conflict. And then finally, lack of social loafing. We need to make sure that we can hold other people accountable. We accomplish that by committing to that overall common purpose, setting and following up on those SMART goals, making sure that we're productively resolving our conflicts, that we're staying focused on the right things in terms of our conflicts, and then building that sense of success so that fundamentally people want to be part of this group. And when that happens, you're not typically going to see social loafing. It's just not going to happen. So together,